This space will be and should be participant-driven and participant-centered. Ultimately, today is yours. The questions that many of you submitted and that now are in your hands as part of the pamphlet are our foundation. And now we will continue to shape this event into whatever, as a community gathered, we believe that it should be.
First, institutions of learning are being run like businesses, and where administrative-heavy corporate models of education are being implemented. Well, they have been implemented. So, as an alternative to this failing model, how should institutions of inquiry conduct themselves? How should we evaluate them?
Especially when universities and other institutions, such as IRES, are exempt from their fiscal responsibilities to the locality, and largely of our law, really, in controlling the land that they occupy. What does it mean to basically afford them a bubble that gives them an immunity from the reality of the local community and society?
I've been hearing on NPR this ad for, starts out, Harvard University, accessible through the Harvard Extension School, classes available on campus and online for students all over the world. And so it's this kind of mixing of just the language of accessibility, mixing of the local and global, and thinking about continuing education.
My question is, as the lady over there, her name, why in the world universities don't pay taxes? I mean, especially Harvard, which has so much money, and those taxes could be used for many good. But why in the world they don't pay tax? I don't know where. When was it established? Who made that law?
There's going to be a monopoly on giving away knowledge. That there's an opportunity to build the go-to brand, the global brand who gives away that information and who controls the way people think about those conversations. So that's really great if you were at the problem you didn't have access to that knowledge. But it's also potentially threatening if when everything's being given away and things are primarily being given away by very wealthy institutions that can afford to do so. It becomes a lot harder for new people to enter the conversation and to have the opportunity to participate in that. Even though it's really cheap to start, it's not free.
You create this globalized elite in contact with each other, and there's all these different types of barriers and separation and levels of securitization surrounding them, keeping them apart from the communities, which nonetheless are economically based on providing them the things they want. And it'd be interesting to look at again, the idea of the sort of university hospital cities that we're increasingly getting, how that's maintained. It sounds to me like what we've been talking about is different types of walls, either that keep people out of places like Harvard, even when ostensibly they are allowed access. One thing I think we could look at and think about is this level of people who are employed what's called garden labor, which has skyrocketed over the last 40, 50 years. More and more people who are employed, since they're not employed in factories, there's every place you go, you see security guards. I mean, this didn't used to exist. I'm old enough, I remember where you didn't see people in uniform, surveilling everywhere you went. There's a million types of levels of cameras and securitization, which is actually how a lot of the working class is now employed. It's interesting to think about what the implications of that for labor struggle are.
It's sort of like the economy I see is between a planned economy or some sort of centralized economy and a gift economy, at least when we're talking about communism on a small level. And the question is, even if looking at Dewey Square as a model with the food tent and all that other stuff, how do we incorporate how do we make our resources planned enough so that it's efficient, and at the same time we allow people to give in a gift economy kind of way that is empowering and prevents it from being too overly bureaucratized. And I know that's sort of an eternal question, but I guess I'd want to hear more people hashing that kind of thing out.
For my community, I think to overthrow all this, we will have to work actually a community and everybody grow their food and disregard money, and maybe trueque, we call it in Puerto Rico. It's you make corn and I'm making tomatoes, and I'll give you some tomatoes, you give me some corn. The lady next door is weaving, I'll get some weaves for her.
What I wanted to say about David's point is that don't you find, I'm an immigrant to this country, I wasn't born here, and I find that often the communities to which my parents and family belong to are already doing this kind of stuff, even though they're not using that name. So that even though, people, I label myself that way, or I have empathies, and some, I use that word. My parents don't, which certainly never called themselves anarchist, and yet there's this real spirit in which people are constantly indebted to each other through these really complicated, non-monetary ways.
And also, in the examples of the revolts in the Middle East, people stay in the squares, and you stay there. You stay in one place, and you're very loud and obnoxious. Whereas it seems the people who are doing most exploiting, they get away with it because they're able to travel around. They're able to have bank accounts where they can move from one point to the next. And we have a history of models based on hunter-gatherers looking at that as an equal society. But we've come to a point now, I think, where really we have to engage our history, and we have to look at where we are right now and what's the most effective way to try to change society.
The question for me is, how can I subvert that structure and subvert that pipeline and be a thorn in the side of these people and use the law as a tool for emancipation, right? And so that's a question where you can't sort of, I think, ask this broad level thing about how can we reorganize the university or something like that. Rather, it has to be what's the relationship between this discipline and the economic structures that it helps to support, and how can that relationship be subverted?
For those of us who are in PhD programs for 7 years, we go through this, and not only is the discipline this disciplining mechanism, but it disciplines us as people, and we have to operate within a system that we are fundamentally opposed to. So my question is, how do we, in that system, even before we get out of grad school, you said we're powerless to change it. Are we powerless to change it?
We talked a little bit about local production and then global industrial production. We talked about the role of the state versus sort of more homespun, Gunthian ideas of production. And I think we also got to a place where we started entertaining that not only alternatives to capitalism, but multiple models. And Tom talked about sort of fair forms of capitalism. We talked about Keynesianism. Someone was talking about state capitalism in China. And I think sort of weighing some of these models and looking planned economies, entertaining Cuba. And although in some ways we touched upon these things very briefly, I think there was kind of an interest in getting beyond what often seemed to be terminology that are exclusive of each other and having a more integrated perspective on these things. And I think that towards the end there was some nice challenging going on between people that were the CSA model, community-supported agriculture. I think that's actually what that stands for, right? Yes. Is so whether or not where that fits into a model. It's in some ways outside the capitalist system. And I think we're only beginning, but to kind of have a little more integrated understanding of some of these terms that often get played against each other.
I think that's the real challenge. That's one reason why it's so hard to come up with a single vision. Because what you want to do is create a society where people can come up with their own visions. That's what freedom means, the freedom to decide individually or collectively what you think value is and how you want to pursue it. So I would throw that out as something to think about in the end. There are multiple forms of value. In a way, and I'll say this as a political point at the end, the most ingenious thing about creating this elite of the universities is the one place where you can think about experimenting with value, which is why it's so important to them, right after the crash, to sort of submit it even more to the logic of the market, despite the fact that universities have actually been doing a fairly good job of educating people, and the market had been disastrous and had just been sort of completely collapsed. The response in so many countries, like the UK again, the really clear one, was to say now we need to privatize and submit education to the logic of the market. Wouldn't the logical thing to do be to make the market more like education, since education that actually functioned and the market had failed? It makes it clear that this isn't a practical decision. This is a political attack on any place where alternative conceptions of value can come out of. And that's what we're experiencing right now. It's not more efficient. In fact, it's hardly inefficient. It's as staunch as creativity, but I think that's exactly what they want. They're terrified of the imagination because the only argument capitalism really has for itself nowadays they're not really arguing it's a good system, they're arguing that no other system is possible. This can only be maintained by a sort of ongoing war against the imagination. And that's one reason why universities, despite the fact that they do produce so much value for them, are nonetheless the targets.